Hi everyone, I'm Hannah. Welcome to my little video about sowing tomatoes. So for reference, I grow on my allotment outside Oxford in the UK, and we have a temperate oceanic climate, which means we have mild winters and cool summers. And the last frost date, importantly for tomatoes, is mid-May. Right, let's go through what varieties I'll be growing. This is now 23rd of March and I haven't sown any tomatoes besides a dwarf one that sits on the windowsill. And there's a few reasons for that, but mainly because I don't have indoor space to grow my tomatoes when they get larger, right? So if I sow them too early, say beginning of March or 3 weeks ago, they would have been 3 weeks larger plants by the time I plant them out, which would be great for maybe getting an earlier harvest, but I have nowhere to keep them. I have no windows that are large enough. I don't have a skylight that would be suitable. I don't have shelving space for large tomato plants. So I wait as long as I dare to sow them. And then I have two different sowing dates, disregarding the dwarf tomato for now, but I have two sowing dates. One is for the tomatoes are going to grow inside the greenhouses and going to grow in my back garden, which is really protected. They can go out earlier into their forever growing spaces, right? The second sowing date, which is beginning of April, are for the ones that I'm going to grow outside on the allotment, in the allotment beds. And that's because they're much more exposed. So any late frosts will affect them, so they can't go out until after that average last frost date, which is mid-May. And I learned this the hard way. Last year I planted my outdoor tomatoes out early, too early, and then we had 3 nights of hard frost. I'd cover them in fleece, but they had a strong reaction to that. So that was enough cold. It affected the way they grew. So at first, when they started growing really odd ways, I was terrified that I had got, a pyrrolid contamination in my compost. It was made during lockdown and I didn't have access to the best of compost, right? But after getting some help and trying to identify it, they're saying that it's probably weather related. So tomatoes are very sensitive to weather. They're obviously not from the UK or from Europe even, they're from the Americas, and they are grown for a warmer climate. So any kind of adverse weather, if it is strong winds or if it's cold temperatures or very, very wet, they don't really respond that well to that. So that's why they grow best in a greenhouse with almost like a tropical kind of climate, right? So that's my reasoning for sowing the dates I'm sowing. I like to sow in a tray and then prick out. So I sow a few seeds of each variety and then I put a lid on, and then I put my grow light on. So this is a grow light that's not very good. It generates a lot of heat, but that's good for germinating worm-loving seeds. So it's perfect for my chilies and aubergines, and it will be good for the tomatoes. So the chilies and aubergines and peppers, those seeds germinate at a very high temperature, at 25 degrees, right? Tomatoes, not so tricky. You can throw a tomato out on the street and they might germinate. The seeds are in that tomato, so it's not that critical for them, but they do like to be inside for sure. So definitely keep them inside. And if you have a heat mat, all the better. I put my tray on a windowsill that's on top of a radiator, and then I have the heated grow light on top. But I've grown tomatoes in the past without those things and it's fine. So I have a lot of varieties this year. Like a lot of people, I think 2020 was a great tomato year on Instagram, and I think a lot of us have gone a little bit overboard. So I'm telling myself I'm going to treat this year as a selection year where I choose my favorites and the ones that are worth growing, that not just the ones that look good, right? Because it's so hard to see. There's so many varieties that look great and you get tempted by all of them. But I work in that way, like I can't just randomly put things in my greenhouses of the seeds of tomatoes that I have, so I have to have like some sort of system. So I've decided I love orange tomatoes, so I'm gonna grow all orange, yellow and goldy colors inside one greenhouse. So that meant that when I went shopping for tomato seeds, I ended up buying a lot of orange yellow tomatoes. So yeah, I don't know if that was so clever. I might sneak in the Black Beauty as well, just to set things off in there. And there are some that are multicolored, but they have some orange or yellow on it, so it's not just yellow, but it's gonna be something, I hope. That's my thinking. So why do I love orange and yellow tomatoes? Well, they tend to have a higher sweetness level. So if you are someone or know someone or have a child maybe that doesn't like tomatoes, it's quite possibly because they've eaten those sour tasting ones from the supermarket. Don't get me wrong, I grew up eating those, and if you put salt on them or whatever, they're edible, right? But they taste nothing like homegrown. And if you're gonna eat a tomato raw, there's nothing better than an orange cherry, sun gold, for example. So that's where I'm coming from with all these orange and yellow seeds. So the compost I'm using is just my usual one, which is a mix of general compost and quite a high percentage of vermiculite. So the vermiculite adds texture and structure to the compost, so it doesn't compact down as much as it might otherwise do. It adds some aeration to the compost, and it also holds water, and so you don't have to water as often, right? So this is great for seed starting, especially seeds that take a bit longer to germinate, maybe, because you don't want to have to water all the time and risk drowning any seedlings that have come up. So in this tray I'm gonna sow 19 varieties, if you can believe it, and I'm not gonna sow more than 3 of each seeds, except for one that the recommendation is that you double the amount that you sow, because it's tricky to germinate. So that's what I'm gonna do. Tomatoes are much less tricky to grow compared to chilies, and pricking them out and potting them on is super easy. So I'm fully hoping that all of these seeds will be, or at least one seed of each will be germinated in the next 1 or 2 weeks. And then I'm gonna do a follow-on video of me pricking them out and potting them up to grow individually. And once that's happened, I'm gonna have to look over my grow light situation because these tomatoes are gonna need the lights, I think, probably much more so than the chilies. So chilies, you can get away with growing on a sunny windowsill quite easily, but if you do that with a tomato, it's gonna run away and become super leggy very, very, very quickly. They're very fast growing plants. Some people think that you should be feeding your tomatoes from early on. That's not the case. Don't do that. Just good general compost will be fine. And then once they're in place where you're gonna grow them and they start producing flower trusses, that's when you start thinking about feeding them once a week with a diluted tomato feed. However, if you're a no-digger like me and you've set up no-dig beds in your greenhouse or where you're going to grow them, you might not even need to feed them because the soil is so rich anyway. But if you grow in grow bags, if you grow in pots, if you grow in bags, then you definitely need to feed them. So I'm doing in my greenhouse, of course, where I have really lush no-dig beds I've just made, but in the back garden I'm gonna use old compost bags to grow the tomatoes in there, sitting on a ledge. So those ones I definitely am preparing to feed along with my houseplants once a week. To feed them, I use either bokashi tea, which is a byproduct of my bokashi composting, or I use liquid seaweed, or I use some homemade comfrey feed, which is very, very simple to do if you have lots of comfrey growing somewhere, which is usually quite common. For example, we have loads growing around our bins. You can also make fertilizer out of nettles or manure or any of these things, so you do not need to buy a feed bottle, but of course it's much simpler, and if that's what you want to do, then go ahead and do it. Okay, that's it. So now they're all sown. I'm gonna put the lid on. I'm gonna put this tray in a water bath, so it lets it soak up some water from below, and then this is gonna drain off a little bit and then go sit in the windowsill with the warming grow light on top. And yeah, we'll check back when they've started coming up and it's time to get them into individual pots.
Hi again, it is now the 31st of March and I'm stood in the greenhouse having just pricked out all the tomatoes that I sowed. So that is now 7, 8, 9, 10 days later. The tomatoes germinated fairly quickly on some varieties, but other ones took a bit longer. So it was a bit tricky knowing when to take the propagator lid off. So you put a propagator lid on or clear plastic over your seed tray to help keep the moisture in. And that's very important for the seeds to germinate. However, the seedlings don't want that humidity growing. It increases their risk of dampening off, and also the warmth that's created, especially from my warm grow lights, leads to leggy seedlings. So some of them are much more leggy than I would have liked them to be. However, you can bury the stem of tomatoes and they respond really well. They have little hairs along the stem that is all there, that are all ready to form new roots. So it's not too much of a worry. Just make sure that you give them enough light, or as much light as you can give them. If you grow your tomatoes on a sunny windowsill, remember to turn them every day or so to make sure they don't grow too much towards the light. I grow mine under grow lights, so that's less of an issue for me, though it is getting a bit tight over there and some of the peppers might be overshadowing them a little bit, so I need to think about my arrangements coming up in the next few weeks. So I grew these tomatoes knowing full well that I would only be able to fit at most one of each variety, most likely. So these are all for growing inside my greenhouses or in the protected part of my back garden, as I said, obviously. So, but I took the decision to pot up all the seedlings that had germinated, just in case some of them didn't respond well to being pricked out. So for some varieties I only actually had one to germinate, which is not that surprising. Some tomato seeds have a harder shell than others, especially the heirloom varieties, which make them harder to germinate. Just to be on the safe side, I did them all, and then I will choose my strongest seedlings at the next stage. Wish me luck with that, because it's always hard to get rid of a fully healthy seedling, right? But yes, when you're pricking out tomatoes, it is fairly straightforward. It's like with any pricking out you do. Use a pointed instrument like a chopstick or the back of a fork, or you can even use a spoon to scoop out much more of the soil underneath or the compost underneath, and then sort the seedling out. Handle them very gently by the leaves if you're unsure. If you're a bit more confident, you can gently support the stem while handling the roots and pricking them into their growing position. When you prick them out, make a deep hole, as deep as your module, to make sure you have space to fit as much of the seedling in. If it's quite a short stemmed one, you can go all the way up to the seedling leaves. Just make sure that the leaves aren't actually touching the surface of the compost, because that might increase the risk of dampening off. Otherwise, you're golden. So once you've pricked them out and planted them in the little new either pots or modules that I've done here, don't be surprised if they go all floppy. So this can happen at any stage of repotting. Tomatoes usually respond like that by going all bleh, right? Give them the water that you were going to give them and then just let them sit. They will hopefully recover unless the stem is broken. So I think this might be due to water loss. So it pays to be quick getting them out of their seed tray and into the new growing position as quickly as possible, so they don't lose too much liquid. So as you can see, I'm using a module tray here, meaning that the tomato seedlings will quickly fill these up with roots, and I need to pot them on into larger pots fairly soon. So you can skip this stage. It's just a way for me to keep all the seedlings in a smaller container so I can keep an eye on and see which one I prefer to keep. But if you have the space, or if you don't have a module tray, just go ahead and put them in whatever growing container you have. I just find in my experience that seedlings quite like being in smaller pots. I don't know if they're more cozy that way. They do respond well to not changing pot size into too large a one immediately. But obviously it's more work, so if you don't have the time, just skip that step. So that's it for now. They're all ready to go in under the grow lights again. I hope this has been helpful to you. You can let me know in the comments if you'd like me to do the follow-on video of them growing on from this stage. I'm also sowing more tomatoes for my outdoor growing soon, and there's more opportunity for more content if you have any questions. So let me know. And I just want to say thank you if you've been watching this far, and if you're new here, consider subscribing because it all really helps. If you want to know more of what I get up to on my allotment, I run a weekly vlog project where every Friday I upload what I've been up to that week, just to keep you motivated, me motivated, and to keep a track of what's actually going on all through the year on my allotment. So go check them out. Anyway, I hope to see you soon.